Hello, I'm Mr. Polk and welcome to my kitchen. Today I have a whole bunch of different cuts of meat for you to take a look at because what I'd like to do is I'd like to review the whole Primal cuts and let you see where they come from, how they look, and how they can be prepared. So if you remember from the earlier videos, we took a look at the basic Primal cuts. And the first one we have is the chuck. The piece I have from that today is I have a chuck roast, America's beef roast. That's also where you get your hamburger, short ribs, things like that. The second one is the rib, where you get your ribeye roast. What I have for today is I have a ribeye steak. We have the short loin, which is where we get one of my favorites, the porterhouse, and we'll talk about its components. Then you have the sirloin. We have a sirloin steak. We finish it off with the round. I have a top round London broil. And then on the underside, I don't have all the examples, but I do have a flank steak for you. And then the only example I don't have out is the short plate and the brisket. But when I talk about the flank, they're very similar. We'll be able to talk about that. So let's start by looking at the first cut. One of the things that I want you to understand is where it comes from in the animal and how it works. So this guy here would be a roast, beef roast, a chuck roast, and this is something that comes from the front of the animal. This one comes from below the shoulder blade. So it's on the upper part of his front legs, and it's going to get exercised a lot. So this type of meat is very active. You're going to notice it has a larger grain to it. Okay, if we take a look at it, as a larger grain. It has a lot of marbling fat in there, but then it has a lot of large chunks of the intermuscular fat. And this is a piece of meat that is going to have to be braised, or it's going to have to be roasted. It's not something that you can just throw in the grill and sear it on both sides and it'll be tender. It has, because it's more active, its connective tissue is built up and it's strong. So what that means is we have to break that down. So this is something that is great to sear it on both sides, either braise it top of the stove or bake it in the oven and just bake it until it pretty much just falls apart. Then as you move through the animal, then you get to the rib section. And this is where people have their prime rib. If you took this piece, took the bone off and some of the fat, and then left it as its full loin, that would be the prime. What you can see here is this is what would be a ribeye steak. We technically can call it a chop because a chop is a steak that has a bone in it. You can call something a steak whether it has the bone or doesn't have the bone. This is where sometimes you see at the butchers they have the tomahawk steak, where this is the actual rib of the animal, and they would let the rib section on. So if you can visualize this on the steer, it's pretty much up like this, because here's where it takes the ribs that go down into the animal. If you were to trim this, if you were to cut the bone off and trim out the fat and leave this nice center section, you would have a really nice ribeye steak, boneless, known as a Domanico. Then we get into the next part of the animal, which is really neat, and this is the short loin. And this is where we get our really nice cuts. This is a porterhouse steak. You can see that it has the bone, okay? And people always wonder what that bone is because it has the two little chunks here, and then it always has that little telltale little groove in there. That's because this is actually part of the vertebrae. This section, if you remember from my diagrams that I showed you in the other video, showing the actual bone structures, you can imagine this being in the steer just like this, okay? This is in this back short loin section. So after the shoulder, get through to the ribs, and then just get into that section where it's just the backbone. It's going to sit in the animal just like this. So picture this bone. This is where you have the part for the spinal cord goes through. All the vertebrae would lock together. So this vertebrae sticks out to the animal. There's another section, because you got to remember this is half the animal. It's cut in half, so you'd have one on the other side. There would be a small section of the bone that comes up this way as well. And that's where when you look on the back of the steer, you see that that structure. This part here is the tenderloin. Okay, so you could buy that as one long strip. This part here is the strip loin. You could buy that as one long strip. And then what's so special about the porterhouse is that this is the tenderloin, which is where we get our filet mignon, and this is the strip loin, where we get like our New York strip. And if you look here is where I have the sections. So here you would have you know, just taking out the filet mignon part coming from the tenderloin, and then taking out the New York strip part. Okay, this is a very, very lean cut. So I know this cut has a little bit of fat on the edge that I haven't trimmed off yet because I want you to see. But if you look inside here, very lean. Okay, and you look at even with the tenderloin that I have here, very lean. But this is something that you cook at very high heat, sear it on both sides, whether it's the grill, the broiler, whatever, skillet, and then you cook it to the temperature that you want, and you're going to have a really nice tender steak. The same thing with this one. You definitely want to avoid overcooking these. This side has a little bit more marbling. Remember, marbling is those small amounts of the intermuscular fat. Okay. Then we move on to the sirloin. So this section, if you remember, has a little bit of the vertebrae, but it also starts to get into that pelvic bone. And that's where you get into like the tri-tip. But this is a really nice cut. This would be the sirloin. This steak has a little bit of marbling to it. It does make for a really nice steak. And the flavor, you start to get a little more beefier flavor. And again, that's where you can look at, and you can even get a flat iron steak out of this section. Up at the top of the animal at the shoulder blade, and it just works its way back, and then we get to the round of the steer. All right, so back around the hind end here, this is where you're going to have it's along, most of the meat comes along the femur, and we kind of divide it up into three sections. We have top round, bottom round, and then the part in the middle we call the eye because it's as the meat goes through. This comes from the top. So really, as we learn, the top muscles aren't exercised as much, so the round has nicer meat up at the top. And again, it all connects through. You know, we work our way through the process. So this would be a London broil. This is a top round. This is something you can do as a roast. Some people even just kind of grill them off. And when you have thinner ones, you can grill them off and take them to a medium. What we're actually going to do with this one is we're going to roast it off to medium rare, slice it, and then we're going to turn it into roast beef sandwiches. One of the things I do want you to notice before I get into the last cut is that all of these retail cuts have been cut, as I've always been saying, perpendicular to the grain. All right, meaning that the muscle fibers, okay, ran this way through the animal. All right, and they were cut perpendicular, so that when you cook this, you're breaking apart the small sections of the connective tissue, and the meat breaks apart. Like this, you know, this was this way, and it got sliced like this. It was this way, it got sliced like this. Now, where does that comparison change is when you get into the tougher meats at the bottom of the animal. And again, I know people say, oh, you say brisket's tough, but it's always tender when I eat it. That's because it's cooked slow and low for maybe 12 hours if it's smoked to get that. Here you can see a flank steak. And the flank steak is going to look very similar to the skirt steak that's in the plate, and then it looks similar to the brisket, but the brisket's usually cut a little more square. What I want you to notice with this cut of meat is that because it would be on the underside of the animal, all right, the grain runs this way. So if you were to grill this entire thing like this and serve it, it would be very, very tough and very difficult for someone to eat because they're constantly cutting through the grain. I mean, that's what I like about the flank is that you can really see that larger grain in there. You can really see those larger developed muscles in there that are tougher, that aren't going to be, you know, nice and fine. I mean, you just can totally see the difference in that. So when you cook this, it's best to cook it on high heat, not cook it all, you know, cook it to the medium, and you want to slice it. This is great for making stir fry, fajitas. You know, take it and cut it this way. And once you cut it this way, now you have these chunks of meat with smaller amounts of connective tissue. You sear them really fast, and you can break them apart. Okay? So now, if we just kind of do a little review, you can see where I want you to understand what the different cuts of meat look like and how they're laid out in the animal, and how that we've got something up here in the front that's exercised more, works harder. It's the front legs of the animal. Okay, that's going to be something that's slow and low. Then we get into the rib, right, which we get your prime rib, or you get your Delmonico. Then you get the loin, short loin section with the porterhouse. And then from that we have tenderloin and New York strip. We get into a really nice sirloin steak. And then we round things out with the round. And you have your top round, which is a London broil. The eye round roast is a rounder roast, really nice roast, one I like to use. And then the bottom round. And then I always think of the army, you flank. You have your flank. And then the piece that I don't have is I would have the plate, which would be the skirt steak, and then the brisket. So that gives you a chance to take a look at all of the parts, all of the primal cuts. And then what's important here is what we call the sub-primals or the retail cuts. And I want to do this so that many times people go to the supermarket, they go to the grocery store, and they go to the beef section and the meat, and they just see all these cuts, and they don't know what to get or what to do. And I wanted to try to demystify that with you today and let you see what they look like and some different ways that you can cook them. So thanks for cooking with me today, and I can't wait to cook with you real soon right here in Mr. Polk's kitchen.